Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I hope folks had a chance to refresh and pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before we dive into this next session. It's our honor to have with us another set of distinguished speakers, mashallah, and we'll be introducing them shortly. Sister Heba Alhadad, Sister Zahra Billoo, and Sister Tasha Williamson. And myself will be looking at the year 2020. And I know just thinking about the year of 2020, for many folks, it may seem longer than that. But subhanAllah, this year has been a year of trials. It's been a year of hardship, a year of growth, a year of blessing, a year that really just allowed us to just take a step back and see what's really going on internally with ourselves, within our own households, within our nation, and the racial reckoning that it has yet to reconcile, as well as it being the year of election, in the presidential election, as well as the census. There's just so much that's been happening this year. And, COVID-19 and the global pandemic. And we want to just press not necessarily a reset button, but for us to just dive a little bit deep into some of the kind of like the major highlights of what's been happening this year, and have kind of like a better understanding of how we can, move on to 2021, which is less than a month away, subhanAllah, in a way that's grounded, in a way that really centers not necessarily just our individual kind of like mental health, but our also community health and community impact as well. And how do we rise to these challenges? First, we will have our dear sister Heba Alhadad, a mentor of mine, mashallah, someone that I dearly look up to. Sister Hiba has received her undergraduate degree from UC Irvine in psychology of social science, later earned a master's degree in clinical psychology, and is currently pursuing her doctorate degree in clinical psychology. She worked at OMID Multicultural Institute for Development, a mental health institute, for 3 years, where she completed her practicum hours and gained a variety of experience working with the Muslim population from different ethnicities and backgrounds. Simultaneously, she worked at the Anaheim Family Justice Center through New Star Family Center in Anaheim with law enforcement, counseling victims of domestic violence and abuse. And so she also served as a case manager for ICNA's first transitional home and shelter for Muslim women in Southern California. Hiba is an affiliate of the Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab, which focuses on providing resources for clinicians, researchers, and community leaders that are working with the Muslim population. Believing that prevention is superior to intervention, Hiba has worked on promoting awareness on a wide spectrum of topics ranging from anxiety to anger management through seminars, workshops, and lectures, and through her role as a mental health instructor at Kaiser Permanente. She believes that psychoeducation has the ability to empower and transform communities, not just individuals. Hiba is part of a group of clinicians and scholars who contributed to publishing a text introducing interventions utilizing the traditional Islamically integrated psychotherapy model to Muslim practitioners nationwide. She perceives learning to be a never-ending process and is continuously seeking to further her self-development in all aspects. Welcome, dear sister Hiba. Alhamdulillah, we're going to tackle a huge issue head on, just about the COVID challenges. What started out like a few weeks of stay at home has become the new normal. And the COVID pandemic has completely changed our lives, from work to school, and the struggles of distance learning and parenting and being teachers at the same time, to community events and family connection. I mean, we're holding the annual convention here virtually. And it has been a challenge to adapt to the new normal in the year 2020. So how has the community adapted to this challenge, and what do we expect, or who do we expect it will impact, or how do we expect it to impact our lives moving forward?
Jazakallah khairan, Ismail, and mashallah, I mean, you really are one of my mentors. I think you have it it's the opposite way. Or the other way around. But I think when we come to think about the year 2020, it's hard to even say that, because it's mind-blowing that it's already almost been a year. And we're still in the situation, subhanAllah, وَلَا اعْتِرَاضَ عَلَى قَضَاءِ اللَّهِ, we don't oppose what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed. But a lot of, there's an analogy that a lot of people resonate with when we think about the pandemic and the onset of the pandemic. And that really is similar to you sitting in a passenger seat or the back seat of a car, and you're taking in the views around you, and you're sort of dozing off, and then all of a sudden someone slams on the brakes, and and now enter into this, you have this rude awakening, in a sense. And it can be a nightmare for some people, or, a not so pleasant experience for others. And I think when we speak about the collective, it's very hard to narrow it down into one word or one set of behavioral responses or reactions. And so we have to be mindful that every single individual is responding in a very different way or reacting in a very different way. And it's hard to, put it all together and say that this is how everyone is responding, or this is how everyone should respond based on certain expectations that we may have. So, just to sort of help get us on the same page in the sense of how we can frame the pandemic, it's really a pre-traumatic circumstance or an event. And what I mean by pre-traumatic is that imagine yourself that you're on some type of movie set, really. And this is how I describe it to some college students or young adults, and this also resonated with them in the sense that imagine yourself you're on a movie set, and you have on your right, and it's really supposed to be a horror movie, but it doesn't have to be a horror movie for everyone who's watching it. Some people who are watching it, they're like, oh, that was just like a suspense movie, and for other people it was a full-blown horror movie. And you have on your right, some weapons, and then you have on your left some tools and screws and hammers, etc. And then you find that if you take a few steps backwards, that you're actually standing on the edge of a cliff, and you may actually fall off if you're not careful. And then you see as you assess, the scene, you assess that there are some small areas of safety, but now I just have to figure out how to maneuver myself and how do I get there. And there are some things that relate to you being able to get there in a safe manner and in order to be able to dwell there. And that really relates to risk factors and privilege, right? This is really ultimately what it comes down to. And I'm sure other, clinicians and other, some of our wonderful speakers who are, Dr. Marwa and Dr. Samira, and inshallah, everybody gets to benefit from their talks, who will really be getting into how to respond to this pandemic. But when it comes to privilege, there are certain individuals or some families that this pandemic hasn't really hit hard, alhamdulillah, right? And so they are surrounded by family members, by a big support system. They've all broken quarantine with one another, and they have spacious homes. So each person, their children have their own space, and they have their own space. Perhaps, some of the parents were already working from home. And so this wasn't a huge shift for them. This wasn't a huge transition. And maybe, one other parent was working part-time. And so they were only out of the home a few times a week. And so this is not a big challenge or transition for them. And you can see where the privilege also comes in. And perhaps they, outsource the meals and the cleaning, and that still continued for them to a degree, right? We have to cut it out at certain points, and then you can bring it back in at other points where you feel like it's safer. And then there are other, groups of families that don't have as much support, right? They may have space within the home to allot to every single person, sort of like a workstation. However, they don't have a big support system surrounding them. So it's really reliant upon them, you and your partner and your children to make it through. And perhaps you have some friends who you've also broken quarantine with, and you're also somewhat supporting each other as much as you can, but each person is drowning to a degree. And so you can't really put that weight on someone else too much. And then we have other individuals, you know, and we know that statistically, you know, especially some Latino, Black, and American Indian communities that have greatly been hit by this pandemic. And, you know, they don't have as much space within the home. And everyone is in close proximity to one another. So naturally, the friction is going to be higher and more conflict, right? Because you can't be in each other's space without it being, you know, more problematic. And so those individuals don't have as much support. Now, add on to all of this risk factors. So individuals who have underlying or pre-existing health conditions or mental illnesses or any physical type of ailment or you know, a psychological or emotional type of ailment, that further complicates, and this is what I mean by risk factors. It really adds on to the stressful load. And so your ability to navigate your way, how wide your path is going to be to navigate or maneuver your way to a place of safety is really depending on your degree of privilege and your risk factors. So those individuals who have high privilege and low risk factors, now we know, of course, that the virus has affected people with no underlying conditions and individuals who are very young. However, predominantly, we're just speaking about, you know, the majority that are impacted tend to be individuals who have some type of risk factors and a lower degree of privilege. So I love the theme of this convention because it's everyone is rising up to the moment in their own way, in one way, shape, or form, right? So we can never say that, you know, and you'll hear this from family members or spouses or, you know, friends who are concerned about their friends, etc. But it's easy to look from the outside and say that, you know, this person is not really dealing with the pandemic. They are sort of avoidant, they're escaping, you know, they're just numb and, you know, seemingly unaware. But I really don't believe that that's the case. And I think everyone is rising up to the moment in their own way. And what that means is that, you know, everybody's responses will vary. And that's why I was saying earlier that we cannot say, you know, that this person's responding and this person's not responding. But there is a difference between reaction and response. And it's important to draw that distinction because reaction really means that, you know, for example, you think you know a person and you've known them for 25 years. However, you've been out of touch with them for 10 years, right? But they reach out to you and you think you know them. So you decide, you know, to not respond to them because you think you know them, right? And so I'm acting from a place of reaction because I'm not incorporating any new bits of information, any growth that this person has made, any changes in their lives. And we know that circumstances and changes rewire the brain, especially situations like the pandemic. Your body and your mind are not going to emerge from this pandemic the same as you were prior to the pandemic. So things change and, you know, circumstances change. And so, you know, you're reacting based on old information without incorporating any new information. And this is detrimental both to self and to the other person. And so you want to make sure that you are responding and not reacting. So individuals who have experienced or been exposed to a lot of trauma in the past, they may find themselves just falling into reactionary patterns of behavior in the sense of always being in fight or flight mode, which is attached to the sympathetic nervous system, which is fight, flight, or freeze. And I'm not really able to process what this pandemic means for me, what it's highlighting to me, you know, what I can learn from it, because adversity is not all bad. And, you know, we have to learn how to befriend adversity. You know, that really is the key to thriving because we don't want to just be in survival mode. And this also relates to perhaps privilege, you know, if you have access to teachers and education, and if you have these opportunities of growth and learning, to be able to reframe that way that you view things, because, you know, it's all about perspective shift or paradigm shifts. that can alter the way that you live and experience things. And so every single person is either reacting or responding. When I respond, I incorporate new information, and I'm able to really assess the situation and try to see it for what it actually is, not allowing my emotions to cloud my judgment. And I'm not therefore seeing things clearly or in a very clear manner. And so some ways that people are reacting and responding is that you may find that people are perhaps avoiding altogether, right? They're not talking about the pandemic. They're not thinking about it. Perhaps also this may be more the case if they lost a loved one to the virus, right? Or a friend or someone that they happen to know, a colleague, which, perhaps they're not ready to process anything yet. And so they tend to be more on the avoidant, escaping the topic, type of reaction. That's not really a response. And so other people are coping by stillness, right? You might find, your partner or your parent, or if you're living, you're taking care of your parents who are aging, is that they may be looking out the window for hours, and or for extended periods of time, or they just may be zoning out in front of the TV. And they're in front of the TV, but perhaps their mind is really busy and thinking and perhaps processing or contemplating as well, which we are actually really encouraged to do. And just, when we reflect on a tadabbur or contemplation, it really comes from the root word dubur, or the ends of things. And so when I reflect on things, I can actually reflect on how this pandemic is changing me. And I really also, one way to frame this pandemic is it's almost as though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has run a highlighter throughout our lives, and everything that needs to be changed, everything that's somewhat problematic, everything that is no longer working. And it's because it's highlighted, you can't any longer avoid it, right? So what that also means is what this pandemic has done is that for everyone across the board is you are now you are forced to face yourself. Before, the world was very conducive to escaping, and the preoccupations and distractions were never ending. And you're running from this event to that event, or dropping off your kids to this practice or to that, session, or, and you were very involved with this volunteering or that work or this opportunity or this event, this social gathering. And there's not many moments, or there are not many moments through which you can pause and really reflect on what is this experience, because every experience is a teacher. And I really believe that this pandemic is a really big teacher, and it's really an opportunity. It's a very painful one for many people, but it's two-sided. So there's the pain, but there's also the other side of it, which is what can I take from this? How can I walk away from this stronger, more resilient, better? But also taking my time to process and going through what is actually happening and how is this affecting me. Now, some people find themselves very irritable and they're sort of lashing out at everyone and getting into minor conflicts with people, and they may not have the capacity to really intake anything or process anything at this time. Now, some people joke about changing from their daytime pajamas to their nighttime pajamas. And so that's also a very real thing for people. It's like maybe one of the things that they enjoy about being home is that they don't have to engage with the world in a way that's demanding or places a lot of pressure on them to look a certain way or be a certain way. Just some individuals have been occupying their time with projects and connecting and reaching out to others, checking up on people, viewing this as an opportunity to provide khidma or service also to others is a very beautiful thing. And you see people, really linking together to be able to support one another, cooking for a friend, and it may be helpful. They're sick, or perhaps individuals and those we love who live alone. So thinking of them as well, and how this may be a very difficult and challenging experience for them in that way too. But there is this underlying grief that I think everyone across the spectrum feels, irrespective of how you're responding or reacting or not responding. There is this sense of grief that everybody is experiencing, and you're grieving really opportunities, missed opportunities. You're grieving. I know college students are grieving, missing graduation this past summer, and then perhaps also missing their graduation this upcoming summer in 2021. So that's something also difficult. And am I even going to get to see, my classmates again? And I'm not going to be in that same environment that I love so much. Or, but whatever really, what this pandemic is also doing is that if there was any pre-existing problems or pre-existing challenges or pre-existing illnesses, you better be sure that, with the pandemic, everything is greatly intensified right now. So it's not diminished, it's actually heightened. And so if you had a rocky marriage, for example, then it's probably gotten much rockier. It hasn't gotten easier. And so, many couples may be turning to therapy and they've been avoiding it and escaping it for so long. And like John Gottman says, couples come into therapy 7 years too late. And because you often have this sense of overconfidence that we'll get through this, it will be okay. It's really not a big deal. We don't need to expose ourselves or go talk to someone who may judge us but now that I think, what's being recognized is because we have to face ourselves and because we have to face our thoughts and we're looking at all the highlighted areas in our lives that need fortification, need strengthening, need to be mended, need some repair, need some love and care and attention. So everything is being intensified. And one thing that can be very disheartening, because you may be misunderstanding it, is that you may feel like I'm regressing into all of my old habits and all of my old ways that are familiar, but not familiar in a good way. They're really familiar in a bad way because I don't want to be back there. I'm not that person anymore who does those things. And so you must understand that, and there's this beautiful drawing, that, I have up just as a reminder, but it really is a drawing of someone walking through a tunnel. And عند الله المتسع, which basically means that I'm walking through a tunnel and I'm walking into an expansive, vast space. And what I can do in a tunnel is not the same as what I can do in a wide, vast, expansive space. So we know that Allah al-Qabid and Allah al-Basit, right? And Allah constricts, but He also expands. And I may be in a circumstance that really brings about constriction, but it doesn't mean that I have to be constricted internally. I can be experiencing a lot of bust internally because of the way that I'm viewing things. And you may be processing and arriving at a point by now in which you've accepted the circumstances. Of course, lower risk factors and higher privilege helps, but even those who don't have high privilege and low risk factors, I've met many incredible individuals who are, struggling, but they're so content and at peace internally. And it's such a beautiful thing to witness because it's an inspiration, and we can draw from means of inspiration such as incredible individuals such as that example. Now, we're really because we're unable to do what we normally would do, and you feel like you can't control the situation. That really is what trauma is, right? But as I said, it's pre-traumatic. So depending on the way that we view things, and studying the virus, and talking to different individuals and seeing, do I really need to live in full-blown fear? Or do I just need to be aware and take precautions? Because there are some individuals who are, really, subhanAllah, taking it to an extreme, and you can't blame them because perhaps they were they had experienced trauma before. So exposure to trauma before will really heighten this experience, and they won't be able to recover fully right away. It will take time. And so, you may be Lysoling everything and bleaching everything. And whenever you get orders, you're wearing masks and gloves. And so there are individuals who are, dealing with it in that way, and that's their way of dealing with it. And it's for no one to really judge or comment about. And then there are other individuals that are very relaxed about it, and they're taking their precautions. And of course, here's the thing, and you will also hear, do you see all those people who are not wearing masks? They're so selfish, etc. It's important for us to also be aware that people don't just behave the way that they do, just because they feel like it. Oftentimes that's not the case, or because they just, are so selfish, and I understand that we live in a very individualistic society, which is problematic to a degree, because we're not really conditioned to think of the other before I think of, I think of myself, and I also think of the other. Really, that could be a trauma response, because you do not trust government and you don't trust authority. And it's not just because, again, you don't feel like trusting them, but perhaps you've gone through experiences in which they've greatly let you down. So you go the opposite direction, and we know, like with our, our Black brothers and sisters, they may have a harder time trusting authority, and that's a trauma response because of everything that their communities have endured. So it makes complete sense. It's not for us to say it's right and wrong, but we're just trying to understand, because when you can understand why the other person does what they do, then compassion can flow, and then, connectivity can come about. And then, really it comes from a place of trying to understand the other person and why they do what they do, can greatly diminish the anger. And it's very easy, again, to judge from the outside, but when you come inside and they allow you the honor of, coming into and their minds and seeing their thoughts and their thought processes, it really begins to make sense. And you have this like aha moment as to why, they behave this way. So you may feel like I'm regressing in a lot of ways, and I'm, going back to my old habits and behaviors, etc. But you're not, because your nervous system is just in survival mode, right? It's just trying to survive. And again, what you would do in a tunnel, you wouldn't do in a vast, expansive space. And then I'll end with this. When we think about post-normal times and what our lives are going to be, we have a lack of predictability and trust now. And that's really the definition of trauma, is whenever I've lost predictability and I've lost trust. So if you've lost trust with your caregivers, that's trauma, because I can no longer rely on the individuals that care for me. And I can't trust them because they don't show up. They don't respond in the way that they should be responding. Now, we're in a peak right now, and we're still somewhat in survival mode due to the surge that we have been warned about in the winter. And then it's supposed to fall into a valley, which is really recovery. And that's also related to burnout for a lot of individuals. And then you'll go back to a baseline. However, not everyone will go back to the baseline, because they may get stuck with depression or anxiety or PTSD. But your baseline after is not going to be the baseline that it was prior to the pandemic. And that's very important to understand. Again, that this experience is either pre-traumatic or full-blown traumatic. And depending on how it affected you, if you've lost loved ones, if you've gotten COVID, right, that's a trauma. And you have to be able to really allow yourself that full recovery with support from professionals and loved ones, in order to be able to reestablish what your baseline is at that point. Now, our lives as we once knew them are not sustainable, as we have seen. There are so many gaps in the system, so many gaps in our healthcare, in our economy, and even the planet is protesting the way that we live as consumers in a very capitalistic world. So we really have to think about, right, the way that we can, and I really, I'll end with this. المرء قليل بنفسه كثير بإخوانه. I think what this pandemic has highlighted is that this isolation or physical distancing, it's not social distancing, it's physical distancing. It really highlights our need for one another and our need for connection and our need for compassion. And as much as things are moving in the direction of artificial intelligence and the realms of medicine and economy and et cetera, and things, we're going to be a lot more hyper vigilant coming out of this in handshakes and hugs, and the way that we used to connect with others before is completely going to change. And we may be a little paranoid. And so we're not going to be as trusting. And that's, again, some of that trauma coming out of this pandemic and the way that it rewires us to really view things in a different light now as a result of our experiences. And so understanding that, I am weaker by myself. However, I can be in a state of thriving with my brothers and my sisters and my community. And that's something that we're greatly missing now. And individuals have adapted really well through Zoom and FaceTime and meeting up while physically distancing with their masks. And so the adaptability is definitely there, but we need to be paying attention to what this pandemic has highlighted to us on an individual level and on a collective level, to be able to draw lessons from that in order for us to emerge from this circumstance better and more fortified and refined, inshallah.
Thank you so much, Sister Hiba, mashallah. As you were just talking, and teaching us, actually, as Sister Tasha put right here, it's really thinking about how do we take this moment and just learn, right? As we're going through it, as folks are trying to survive, how can we approach this from a place where we are thriving down the road as well? So I'm just thinking about just how this has been a year of growth and year of adaptability, as you mentioned, and how it's been a year of opportunity where I feel like Allah has taken away the noise, even as we're dealing with a global pandemic, so we can really just take away all the fluff and realize, as human beings, what do we need to survive? What do we need to thrive? And what does it mean for us to be in community with us? So thank you so much. We will have Sister Tasha Williamson come up as our speaker. And Tasha, I've known Tasha for a very long time. I've been in the trenches with her, and it's just been an amazing experience being able to speak truth to power alongside you and learning from you for such a long time. Tasha Williamson, she's an American activist. She's a community leader. She's one of the only Black woman that was running for mayor here in the city of San Diego. And she spent her career really advocating for families that have been impacted and affected by gun, gang, and police violence, and protesting and holding powers to be accountable when it comes to police brutality. She co-founded the San Diego Compassion Project in 2018, spoke up for families that have been either sidelined or whose voices were not being heard, and ran for mayor here in San Diego, and was one of the People of the Year in the San Diego City Beat. And my dear sister Tasha, it's always an honor to hear from you. So folks, hold on, because Tasha always lays things like down. So I'm going to be quiet right now so we can hear from Tasha, because it's such an honor. So Tasha, please go ahead. This year has been just dealing with
thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Tasha.
You. Thank you. And thank you, Sister Hiba, who went before me. I appreciate the lesson, because it was a lot of powerful teaching. I want to say, in like mind with Sister Hiba, that every experience, as she said, is a big teacher. I think what the rest of the world has now knows is how Black people feel. Always being in survival mode. This is not new to us. This is new to the rest of the world. one of the things that I want to talk about and touch on with the Black life struggle is that this has been a generational struggle for Black people, when men, women, and children from all economic statuses, it has touched all of us. And that Black Americans have always fought for the good of our country, even when that country has denied us our rights. That was a quote from Patrice Cullors in October of 2020. What you have seen time and time again in history, on social media, and on the televisions, is that Black lives have been brought to the forefront because so many of us have been slaughtered in this country and other countries. The Black Lives Matter movement has not just started and stopped in the United States of America, it has gone global because Black people or people who have darker complexion all over the world are treated with disdain and disregard, and are separated and made to feel as though they are less than. And that struggle started from birth. That struggle started from the birth of this nation when they brought us here. And so oftentimes we think of just recently the names of people who have been killed at the hands of police brutality. But this had been going on for generations and is dated back to the 18th and 19th century of how we were treated and killed. So we not only look at our present, but go back into the histories to see that things may have changed names from situations like slavery becomes racial terror, and now with total systemic failures. And so we've gone from a history of slavery to Jim Crow, to mass incarceration, to implicit biases, which is all encompassed under racism. America loves money. Almost everything this white power structure government does is based around economics. And so trillions of dollars are spent on the trauma and terror of Black people. Black women, Black men, and Black children are failed. Failed schools, failed incarceration, failed child welfare services, failed healthcare, failed environmental protections, failed housing, failed banking, failed business investments, failed legislation, failed court systems, failed public safety, failed quality of life. And we know this because they often collect data to be able to determine how to better help people in society. And what we know from their data that has been collected by these failed systems is that Blacks have the highest disparities in all categories. So when we talk about the Black life struggle, we want you to know, and that the world knows, that the Black lives have been struggling for generations, because they have increasingly collected data over those generations to be able to know that Blacks have the highest rate of health disparities, that Blacks' median income has declined far below 26.1% decline below that of whites. Black high schools are failing. Black students in high schools, I should say, are failing at an alarming rate. You look across the board that home ownership, you know that if you own, that you're able to sustain a lifestyle outside of poverty when you own businesses and you own homes. And yet Black people have had to deal with some of the most egregious banking industries who have shielded and made certain that Black people could not get loans so that they could operate businesses and be homeowners at the rate of other ethnicities. And so it is very clear to us that I have often said, dear America, does Black minds matter, Black lives matter, or Black power matter? in this, it's because America has made a lot of broken promises of freedom, justice, equality, and equity. And I say that in all caps. I'd shout it if I could. Economically, Black life in America is worth more incarcerated than educated. We know that because they have constantly built incarceration institutions to house Black people at a rate that not many others are being housed. And when we look at the ratio, we're basing that on the population versus the impact. And so the Black people have a smaller population, but yet a larger population is incarcerated. Black people have a smaller population, but yet a larger population is dying of COVID-19 health and other health disparities. So one of the things we want to talk about, among COVID-19, and I think Sister Hiba talked a great deal about it and educated, especially myself, and I'm sure all of you, that when COVID-19 happened, it was almost like when Trump was elected. Everybody was shook, but not many Black people, because we have lived in this despair and survival mode, and going from poverty to middle income, back to poverty, in all of these circumstances, when America's economic development is devastated. So for us, this event, not to say that people are not dealing with the issues Sister Heba talked about as far as mental health and isolation. Those are very serious issues. But Black people tend to deal with them a little differently, because we are always, once we walk out of our doors, stuck in survival mode, because we never know what is going to happen to us. We can't control the outcomes of what other people will do to us because of the color of our skin. We are not invisible to the world. We are always noticed. We are always subjected to someone's biases or views. And so for that, we have been living in COVID-19 era all of our lives. And so for us, it is a little different than it would be for people who have the freedom to be who they are, without being subjected to Karens and Kens. For those who know what that entails, when white women and white men approach us and say very racist things, these are the terminologies we have given them. I think we should find out what their names are so we could call them who they are instead of Karen and Kens, because we had one the other day. Unfortunately, listening to Sister Heba, I have actually not been isolated, because I have been responding as an essential worker that's not getting paid as an essential worker. I have been responding to homicides and suicides and vehicular accidents. I have still been responding to help family members and community members when police arrive and stop vehicles. I have still been responding when people are going to the hospital or children are having issues with schools. And so for that, I have not had the time to be isolated, because there is still much work to be done to ensure that people are getting the things that they need, because they are not. Because with COVID-19, equity, equality, and justice was still lost, but it was shielded by COVID-19, so people could not openly see the injustice and the inequities and the lack of equality that they are doing to us and to many other people. And so with that, I will say that this is still causing generational harm and impacts, and that Black Lives Matter is more than a movement. We are finding that community is speaking up. filming police interactions, learning how to author legislation, questioning white power structured systems openly and fearlessly, educating their neighbors, families, and friends. Police accountability is at the forefront of politics like never before. Progressive change agent is what I want to call them. Politicians are being elected. These change agents are being elected into major political offices. Community review board oversight, like the one in San Diego, California, that was just voted in, Measure B, is being run by community with no police or government collusion. A little more cases of officers being charged for the harm and murders and negligence that they have caused to people. These are some of the things that we are finding that have happened during and before and currently in this year that have impacted and shaped the movement and galvanized entire countries to join alongside of Black Lives Matters movement and Black people to make sure that they are safe and they know that they are not alone. And so moving forward, I would say that to people, if you see police stopping someone, get out your cars, film them. You don't have to speak to them. Stay at a distance. Make sure they know that you see them and that those individuals know they are not alone. If you know someone who is being impacted, stop, see what you can do for them, care for them, because that slogan is not just a slogan. We are literally all in this together. And I hope that we will stay that way. I hope that people will still come together and check on each other and make sure we are well and stop for just a few seconds to save a life. If you guys have any other questions or you wanted to know anything, I want to save a piece for questions and answers as well. But I also want you to know that when you see these activists out here, that you understand there is a thing called activist fatigue. And that to make sure that those activists in your neighborhoods or your states or your communities or your mosque are doing well. Check on them. Make sure that your heroes and sheroes have everything that they need, because they are fighting not just for the lives of their own, but they are fighting for the lives of everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tasha. And I know Tasha's been at the forefront of really addressing police brutality and holding folks accountable. But a lot of the beautiful services that Sister Tasha does also is, as the pandemic was happening, she was at the forefront of making sure that our unsheltered and houseless folks were able to receive shelter. The model that she was engaged in, the model that she started, it's a model that's being replicated here in the city. So just think about, again, those activists, those folks who are on the ground, who are constantly lifting up communities that have been disenfranchised, communities that have been made invisible because of the status quo that exists in society. And as we know from our faith as well, that we honestly have to feel a sense of duty, feel a sense of belonging in a world where justice and equity prevails, where we're always constantly checking what privileges do we have, and how do we best utilize whatever privilege that you have to make this world a better place for those who are living at the margins. And Tasha has been just an exemplary citizen, really defining what it means to be an American, and just really, I know there's definitions of what that is, like growing up and just the impact of white supremacy kind of culture in our minds. But subhanAllah, it just really allowed us to just think about what does it mean for us to really create a better world and leave a better world and around us. So Tasha, thank you so much for your service. Thank you so much for all that you do. And very humble in not really talking about a lot of the impact that you had. But let's just say if a conversation is brought up and Tasha brings it up, let's just say folks get uncomfortable because they know there's going to be accountability that's going to come with that as well.
And just know that uncomfortability is where the greatest change happens. Everybody should be uncomfortable because we need growth. So uncomfortability is growth. It's not negative. We need to be uncomfortable, because then we can see and our minds can envision all the things that we can do and become in that and out of that uncomfortability.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We'll
Thank
leave
you.
the question and answer towards the end.
Okay.
So hang tight, and then inshallah we'll bring up our third speaker, my dear sister Zahra Billoo. Alhamdulillah. Sister Zahra, may Allah bless you always. She serves as Executive Director of the Council on American Foreign Relations, San Francisco Bay Area chapter, the oldest and one of the largest CARE chapter offices. May Allah bless our organizations. Since joining in 2009, Zahra has led the organization through a period of six-fold growth. Today, she manages one of the largest care offices in the country with a team of civil rights and social justice advocates that are dedicated to the empowerment of American Muslims through legal service, legislative advocacy, and community organizing. Under Zahra's leadership, CARE San Francisco Bay Area has filed lawsuits against the United States Department of Justice, Abercrombie & Fitch, and Southwest Airlines, representing American Muslims facing discriminatory treatment. CARE San Francisco Bay Area has also significantly expanded its capabilities to provide Know Your Rights sessions on a nearly weekly basis to mosques and community members in the San Francisco Bay Area, while also providing direct legal representation to Bay Area residents facing numerous civil rights violations, including FBI interviews, employment discrimination, airport harassment, school bullying, and hate crimes. As we're talking about the global pandemic that we face, the pandemic of racism, we also know that this year has been a pivotal year regarding just the elections, right? And every American home and many throughout the world were closely watching the 2020 election week, eagerly awaiting for results. However, we also know that there has been a lot of on-the-ground organizing and impact from just across the board, multiple different organizations and individuals really leaving their legacy, leaving their impact in this election. And what we've noticed is how the very communities that are often marginalized, that are forgotten by both political parties, are the ones who've been carrying this union on its back. So Sister Zahra, if you can just kind of give us some of the learning, the lessons, all the work that has went in both in defending our democracy, but also hoping and envisioning a better world that we belong, inshallah, here in America. So Sister Zahra, welcome.
Absolutely. Jazakallah khair, Sister Ismahan, and really everyone at Mass Los Angeles for putting together this weekend's convention. A lot of people have talked about how they miss spending time with family and eating the various foods that the holiday weekend brings about, but I really miss being with all of you in person. And I'm so grateful to the leadership at Mass LA for having the foresight to move the convention online and then to also make it free and accessible for everyone. Something that I'm often reflecting about with conventions is how I wasn't able to attend them as a young person in a working class family. They are inaccessible because they're expensive, there's travel, there's hotels involved. And so one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that so much of the programming that was inaccessible for members of our community who are working class or who live in areas where they would have to travel long distances is now available online. And so Jazakallah khair, Sister Ismahan and the Mass leadership for making this convention accessible to everyone despite everything that's happening. I also wanted to start by quickly acknowledging that I'm, dialing into all of you from Ohlone land. Those are the indigenous people who lived where I am sitting today, where the CARE San Francisco Bay Area office is. And on this weekend, when Americans celebrate a false narrative of the way in which European colonizers came into and interacted with the indigenous people, it's really important for me and hopefully all of you to remember who was here first. And one of the ways that we do that is by learning about whose land we're on. If you, like me, were born here or came here escaping something, then in many cases you don't have anywhere else to go. And so I'm not asking you to leave the indigenous land, but rather to learn about it and to honor the traditions of those who were here first, and to make sure to think critically about the way we are taught about this history. And so again, starting with recognition of and acknowledgement of the Ohlone people who lived here where I now sit. So with that in mind, I I wanted to tell you a story. I wrote out some notes, but in thinking through what Sister Ismahan prompted me on right now, a story came to mind, and I think I'll start there. It's actually of the newly elected district attorney in Los Angeles County, George Gascon. I first met George Gascon in 2010. He was at the time the police chief for the city and county of San Francisco, and the police department was proposing a earthquake measure, a bond measure that would seek more funding for the Hall of Justice, as they call it, which is where the main police headquarters are based and also where a lot of people who are arrested are held. And he was at a private fundraising breakfast for the bond. And he said, in trying to convince the donors to give, he says, the Hall of Justice is as susceptible to an earthquake, knocking it down as it is to members of the Middle Eastern community parking a van in front of it and blowing it up. Now, if you're sitting here and you're listening to this in Los Angeles County, that sounds nothing at all like the George Gascon that you know and that many Muslim community leaders endorsed and even campaigned for. But that's what he said. Members of the Muslim community, members of the Middle Eastern community, parking a van in front of it and blowing it up. Now, there was a reporter in the crowd, and that reporter was taken aback by what was said. This is San Francisco. We don't accept language of that sort. And he confronted George Gascon, and he said, "What do you mean, members of the Middle Eastern community? Like, what are you talking about?" To which George Gascon made it even worse, actually. He said, "Oh, I mean people from Yemen and Afghanistan." Now, can you imagine my reaction? I'm a first-year care executive director in what is even at that time considered the most progressive region in the country. And the police chief of a police chief in not just the most progressive region, the most progressive county in the most progressive region, is on the record saying something this incredibly racist, this kind of fear-mongering when we're out here trying to protect our community from law enforcement interactions. We're trying to dispel stereotypes. We're combating Islamophobia. And we want to believe that here we can rely on our government officials to protect us, to be a buffer between us and the federal government, to protect us from private actors who are Islamophobes, and for us to be able to call them when Islamophobia happens on the streets. And so immediately there's community uproar, there's opposition, people are, we need to protest. And so the community came together in San Francisco. I still remember it was CARE and the Asian Law Caucus and the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, the Arab Cultural and Community Center, the Yemeni American Association, and a number of masjid leaders. And so people put aside their organizational disputes, they put aside their boundaries and their lines and their politics, and they said, okay, we need to work together on this because we're all in danger if this is the man who runs the police department in this city and county. And the Yemeni community in particular stepped up, and they said, we need to have him come speak to the community. And I was really nervous about this because, I don't want politicians to think that they can engage in photo opportunities with our community and then be let off the hook. But he came to Jummah prayer. The Yemeni community moved their Jummah prayer from the local masjid in the Tenderloin in San Francisco to a Hilton across the street. The Yemeni community members came in from across the region. I think there were more than 1,000 in attendance. And George Gascon came. He came to the audience. He had, of course, it was a pre-meeting. There had been some prep. He knew what was expected of him. And he clarified his remarks, which is to say that there was no right answer to them. And then he apologized. And the community gave him, I remember they gave him a Quran. And some of us were excited about it. Some people shook their heads like, is this really the way to go? But for me, what mattered was that it was the beginning of a relationship. And it was a relationship where we weren't holding any punches. We were saying we want to be in communication with you. We know that we need you to protect our community. And we know also that we will hold you accountable. He went from being police chief to being the district attorney. And in the years that he was the district attorney, Pamela Geller and others bought anti-Muslim bus ads in the city of San Francisco. They were running pictures of Osama bin Laden and people from Iran, all sorts of just like bad Islamophobic tropes were running on buses across the city of San Francisco. And George Gascon and the Muslim community had continued to cultivate that relationship that began in strife in 2010. And he and Hala Hijazi at the time, a sort of an incomparable Muslim community leader in the city of San Francisco, pulled together a Muslim advisory group. They led the charge on condemning the bus ads, condemning Pamela Geller, urging the Board of Supervisors to condemn Islamophobia. And through their work, through their work, led the passage of the first resolution at any county level across the country condemning Islamophobia. And then they took the money from the bus ads and they put them into anti-Islamophobia work. They put them into supporting the work of the Muslim community. And so they said, okay, we have no choice because the First Amendment requires that we run these ads. And so now we have this money. But rather than the city or county benefiting from this money, we're going to reinvest it in the communities that have been most hurt by what is going on. So George Gascon, because of the community's investment, the community's engagement, and the community's unapologetic activism, went from being someone who we opposed and who we were trying to get fired to someone who was one of our biggest allies. And so it came as just such a pleasant surprise for me when I saw that after leaving San Francisco, he had come to Los Angeles, and in Los Angeles was running as a progressive district attorney. It meant so much to me to see that he had reached out to Muslim community leaders in Los Angeles County to say, I want your support. I'm going to engage the Muslim community. And now not from a place of I'm in trouble, I need to apologize, but rather from the place of I see you as an asset. And I know that if we work together, we are all stronger for it. There are problems with the district attorney's office in Los Angeles. We know that police officers continue to get away with violence against civilians without any accountability. And I want to do something different about it. And I need the Muslim community with me for me to make that happen. Now, the reason I tell you that story is because that's how I'm thinking about where we are with the 2020 election. Let's be clear. What we have experienced in 2020 is not new, right? So the COVID-19 pandemic exposes the broken healthcare system, exposes the reality that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, exposes that we can't, unfortunately, rely on our government to regulate things in a way that makes sense. It boggles my mind that countries that are far less developed and far less resourced than ours have conquered the pandemic without any issue, and they're doing just fine. Talk to people in Australia, talk to people in New Zealand, talk to people in parts of Europe, and they're doing okay. People are getting taken care of, but here we are in the most wealthy country in the world, knowing that this weekend there are millions of people facing food insecurity, which means that they don't know where their next meal is coming from. I always say to my friends, and I say to myself, the fact that I had breakfast and I know where lunch is coming from makes me more privileged than the average person. So COVID-19, yeah, like the disease, the virus itself is new, but the realities it exposes are old. The same is true for Black Lives Matter. Sister Tasha and Sister Hiba both talked about how people are suffering and how there's just such incredible work that is ongoing. And Sister Tasha talked about this in depth, and so I don't need to repeat it, right? But just as a reminder to myself and to others of you who are tuning in, who are first and second generation immigrants, whose parents came to the United States in pursuit of the American dream, know that that American dream was built on the backs of Black and Indigenous people who were subject to genocide, right? Who were subject to the most inhumane conditions in this country's history and really in world history. And that those conditions in many cases have not ended. Indigenous people still don't have full sovereignty over the land, still suffer from the consequences of broken treaties. Black people are not enslaved in the way that we are taught slavery existed. Rather, they are enslaved in prisons. They are criminalized on the streets. They are brutalized by police officers. They continue to suffer the highest rates of incarceration and targeting by our state forces. I remember I read once a death row survivor had talked about how the white robes of the KKK became the Black robes of the justice system. And so what we are experiencing, what we are talking about, what we are assessing right now in 2020 are not new problems. They are problems that we weren't thinking about in many cases prior, that we weren't seeing as visibly prior. And so the work that we have to do is also not new work. We learn it from our traditions. We learn it from the legacies of Indigenous and Black people who have worked so long in this country to give us what we have, right? To take what we have. A lot of people, when we talk about power and we talk about rights, we say, that rights are not given, that they are taken. That power is not given, it must be taken. And so when you look around today and you turn on the TV and you're like, oh, the system is broken, remember, it's not broken. It's working exactly how it was supposed to. It was built by white slave owners, rich white slave owners, rich, straight men, white slave owners, right? Like the list of sort of attributes gets longer, but continues to tell you that they did not have us in mind. They did not have women, people of color, immigrants, Black people, Indigenous people, right? Poor people. They didn't have any of us in mind. And so today when we look around and we say, okay, it's not working, it's not supposed to work for us. It's supposed to work for them. And guess what? They're still getting richer. I think about this a lot in terms of the pandemic, is that some people have lost their jobs, but others have done really well. If you hold tech stock, you've done really well. And I hope you will give more generously to Mass and CARE and AMP and everyone else that works for the community this year. If you are a property owner, you've likely done well. If you're a business owner, you've likely done well. And that should come as no surprise. So where are we? I mean, I think many of us will talk about election week 2016, and then we'll talk about election week 2020. And what's most memorable about election week 2020 is that we didn't have results. For the first time in 20 years, the last time we didn't have results the day after election day was the year 2000. And so fast forward to 2020, and most of us, by the way, not most of us, some of us, are young enough that we barely remember the 2000 election. I often go to Wikipedia to refresh myself on the details. And so with 2020, we didn't have election results the next day or the day after or the day after. And we finally got them. And I think for many of us, we breathed a sigh of relief. And it wasn't necessarily because we were happy about Joe Biden or because we have any illusions about how he might be better for us, but rather because it meant that we had stood up for something that was different, that we had stood up to say, enough is enough. We recognize how broken everything is, how it's not working for us when we want it to. And so we need to take matters into our own hands, right? Let's be clear, 70 million people voted for Donald Trump. And that is heartbreaking. It means that for everyone that didn't know he was a racist in 2016, they should know now and they didn't care. For everyone that is concerned about COVID-19, they still didn't care. For everyone that is worried about how we are spending our money, about corruption, about decorum, or any of those things, they still didn't care. They put their well-being over our collective well-being. They put their wealth over our collective wellness. And that is a problem. But 74 million people voted for Joe Biden. Again, not necessarily because they loved him or they were excited about him. Many people I know who voted for him were simply voting for the alternative. But the alternative for them meant that they would band together for Black Lives Matter, that they would band together for universal health care, that they would band together for cancellation of student loan debt, that they would band together to end the Muslim ban. And the list is ongoing. And so that's where we are now when it comes to campaign promises. And before I get to campaign promises, let me say that this win did not come easy, and it did not come because the Democratic Party got it right. It came because grassroots organizers across the country said we need to take matters into our own hands, right? We saw Black women helped flip so many states. Georgia went blue because of Black women's leadership, right? People in Minnesota, right? Not Minnesota, Minnesota, Michigan, all these places, right? Where many, many Muslim populations are banned, got together and said, we are going to ban the president that is trying to ban us. We saw people in places like California making phone calls to Arizona, to Georgia, to Nevada, all these places that we thought were strong red holds were not, because people did the work. They said, we need to get, as Sister Tasha said, we need to get uncomfortable. As Sister Hiba mentioned, this has been such a hard year. And one of the ways that we move out of it is, as Sister Tasha said, we have to get uncomfortable, which means we need to do the work. We can't take these things for granted. And so with that in mind, where do we go now? We have an administration that has a track record that is very concerning. Let's be just fully transparent about this. Joe Biden's track record in the Senate is terrifying. Joe Biden's track record as Barack Obama's vice president is no less comforting. The drone wars increased under Barack Obama. Surveillance of our masajid and our community leaders continued under Barack Obama. U.S. citizens were executed abroad under Barack Obama. Deportations happened in the millions. The list is ongoing. And so what will be different this time? Well, this time, many of us, people in their 30s and 40s, now have lived through numerous administrations. So we have lessons that we can apply from the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and the Trump administration. This is our opportunity to take a slight break, we hope, from being defensive and go to being offensive, from reactive to proactive. We absolutely need to undo the harm that happened under the Trump administration, the Muslim ban, the ravaging of COVID-19, the economic crisis, right? The ongoing wars. And so anyone that tells you, by the way, that Trump has engaged in less wars and violence abroad has not looked at the data. He has continued and sometimes even increased the violence abroad. Liberty for Palestine, by the way, is something that has become further from reality under the Trump administration. And so the list of harms we have to undo is long. But we also have an opening to say we are going to build something better. And I really want to push you on this. We have been so under attack as a community that we only really know how to think about how. We have forgotten how to dream at times, and instead all we're thinking about is how to beat back the bad, right? So we need to abolish ICE. We need to defund the police. We need to get healthcare for everyone. But how much of that is just a reaction to the bad? The question I want us to ask is, what is the society we want to build? What does it mean to rise up to the moment, to leverage the opportunity, to leverage the organizing that has happened across the country and say, if I were to close my eyes and dream of the country I want to raise my children and grandchildren in, to look forward 25, 40, and 50 years and say, if we could do everything the way we wanted, what would it look like, right? Would it mean open borders? Would it mean an end to prisons? Would it mean healthcare and food security for everyone? We know what happens when we organize. When we organize, we win, right? And by the way, and I haven't talked about this because this wasn't my prompt, but I will say it because it's important that we remember we're at a mass convention. When we organize as Muslims, we don't just organize for the sake of political organizing. We organize because we believe Allah calls us to it. We believe that this is our religious obligation. I talk to people day in and day out about religion versus politics, and very religious people would say to me, well, I'm not involved in politics. I don't see politics as separate. Politics is integral to the way we live our lives as Muslims. Our clarion call as Muslims is to fight for justice, to advocate for justice, to use our hands and our tongues and our hearts to forward justice, not just for Muslims, because Islam isn't a mercy just for Muslims, it's a mercy for everyone, right? And so that is our clarion call. And so when we organize, we do it from a place of faith and from a place of principle, which means that we have to first and foremost fulfill our religious obligations, our obligations to our families, our obligations to our communities. We have to ensure that the wealth that we are spending on our organizing is from a place of halal risk. We have to ensure that when we are doing this work, that we are doing it from a place of principle, that we are honest, that we are consistent, that we are telling the truth, and that we are building alliances that advocate for justice, and that we are not compromising anywhere along the way. And we know that when we do that, when that's our starting place, and then we do the hard work, that we can and will win. And so our challenge now, as we think about how we go forward, right? We have just a few more weeks left of this current fascist president. The next president comes into the same fascist system. Let's be clear, we haven't changed the system. We have changed the person leading it, right? But this is our opportunity to say we're going to organize from the inside and the outside. We are not going to rest just because we got incremental change. We cannot rest when people are hungry, when people are in jail, and when violence continues as an American way of life. We will keep on keeping on. Remember, there's an election every 2 years in most places in this country. We are electing and re-electing members of Congress. We are electing and re-electing members of the Senate. We are electing and re-electing people like George Gascon, who decides which police officers pay the price, which Black and brown people go to jail, and how our ordinary backyard communities are run. And so I want us to celebrate. I want us to be relieved. I hope that you will find a safe and healthy way to spend time with your family this weekend. I hope you will support small businesses today on Small Business Saturday. And I hope that you will give to all of your favorite Muslim charities on Giving Tuesday. But know that our work must continue. People ask, like, do you not get tired? Can you take a break? When does it end? And I think often about our prophets, peace be upon them, all of them, who gave their lives to this work, who knew that small incremental change was important and that we needed to celebrate, but that our work wouldn't finish. And so our work doesn't end when the new president takes office. In fact, it should get more intense because our barriers to entry have shifted, because we will be slightly less under attack and we will have an opportunity to do more. We know that when we fight and when we organize, we win. And so let's keep on doing that. Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khairan, Sister Zahra. As you said, the organizing intensifies now because the points of entry will be changing. As we know, again, and the reason why we're highlighting these critical points, even though there's so much for us to talk about, I mean, 2020, it just didn't feel like just a year, right? But the reason why we're highlighting COVID-19, the pandemic, as well as this kind of racial reckoning of folks kind of waking up to the reality that our African-American family have been living through, as well as dealing with I guess not necessarily just the results, but the work and the organizing and the framework, shifting our perspective on what the election means for us, just kind of highlights for us, again, on an individual level and on a communal level, what does it mean for us to bring about that change that we need? We have to see how things are intersecting. As all three of our wonderful speakers pointed out, the pandemic that we're faced with laid bare the social inequities that already existed, right? The, I guess, election that we've seen, we know democracy does not start or nor does it stop at the ballot box. A lot of the work, a lot of the organizing happens outside of election time, where instead of just turning out to vote, folks are holding accountable those who have been put into office, whether it's on a national level and is the president, or on a local level with your city council members, to your district attorney, representatives, to just across the board, folks who've been elected into office. What does it mean to hold folks accountable, and what role do we have in play? What role do we have to play in this system? One thing that I will leave you with, as we're kind of going to switch over to Q&A with our speakers, is I forget who said this quote, but even if you're not interested in politics, politics is interested in you. Whether it's the freeways that you drive through for those who are able to drive, or whether it's, you know, the way we kind of center ableism in society in a way that continues to marginalize folks with disability, to dealing with economic injustice, to environmental injustice. Politics plays a role. The neighborhoods that we grow up in, right? In areas that have so much toxin that leads to asthma and few other respiratory illnesses for folks who are living at the margins. So what can we do to always connect our individual struggle to that which is going on collectively, and what policies are impacting how we are living our lives, and how those policies continue to impact those, whether they're living here in the United States or abroad, as we've seen with the Muslim ban and the conversation about foreign policy earlier with Brother Sami and Brother Hussam. So right now we'll switch over to Q&A. Inshallah, Sister Hiba, the first questions will go to you. So we'll come to you, inshallah. But the first question is, how do we balance between thinking or not thinking too much about COVID, yet live a normal life when media and internet sometimes portray it in an extreme way?
Sorry, my mic was muted. I completely understand the question, and I think I liken it to being held accountable by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're never alone in actuality. I think the reality of the matter is that we always have our Creator watching over us. So in a sense, it's not okay for us not to have our privacy, of course, and that creates a sense of hypervigilance, as we always feel like we're being watched. You know, and we are unable to really, you know, be the way that we want to be, or live the way that we want to live, because we always feel like we're being watched. And I think Zahra can definitely weigh in on this. But I think from a spiritual angle is, are we living a life in which we have so many things that we, you know, need to hide? And am I okay with facing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with the life that I currently have, with my lifestyle and my behaviors and the things that I contribute and the things that I partake in or refrain from? So it's definitely something for us to think about. But I'm sure, you know, Zahra and Sister Tasha can weigh in on this as well from a different angle.
Thank you so much, Hiba. Yes, please feel free to answer that. But we also have another question. And Tasha, this one is for you. Feel free to add to what Sister Hiba mentioned, as well as answering this question. So we know that when it comes to just the Black liberation, folks are willing to put out statements. Folks are willing to just post on social media and just go to protest, say Black Lives Matter. But when the real work comes, when that moment comes where folks really have to embody what it means to be a true ally or co-conspirator to the Black liberation struggle, folks don't tend to step up. And we're seeing this play out here in San Diego. We've seen it play out nationally across the board, where folks are like, yes, Black Lives Matter. And then all of a sudden take a step back when we say, hey, it's not just about their lives mattering, it's about centering their leadership, centering their experience. And, just based on everything that you've been through as well, what message do you have for, I guess, the slogan oriented folks as opposed to the folks who are willing to do the work and take a step back?
Yeah, I think that, this is new for a lot of people who consider themselves to be allies or co-conspirators or woke, right? Because that's a term that people use too. I think that, there's a story I often tell, like I was working when Donald Trump got elected as president, and I walked into my office space, which was a conflict resolution center, and white people were crying. And, I walked in and got to work. And they said, why aren't you devastated? Why aren't you crying? Aren't you like, what is the world going to look like in 4 years? And I said, it looks every day for me. Like nothing changes for me because now we have another racist president. Nothing's going to change the outcomes for my people with Donald Trump. So like we are born into this experience, right? And so I say to those folks that education, we have a group here called Showing Up for Racial Justice. It is a all white led group to teach white people about white privilege and racism and what it is to show up and stand with and follow, Black leadership, right? What it is to support, what it is to fund, what it looks like in its totality. And so oftentimes, and, when I had that press conference and, the privileged white journalists tried to attack me, and I clapped back and said, it's not my job to make you feel comfortable and to educate you. It's your job to go out and do the research so that you know what is appropriate and what is not, and what is going on and why people are upset and burning down buildings, right? It's not my job because I didn't get us here. Your people did. And so for me, I say that more white people need to step up, and they need to actually step into the fray and start educating their people, like Showing Up for Racial Justice does and other groups do. Because, I will step back because Christina Griffin Jones always tells us, that we have to kind of help our white sisters and brothers to understand where they're being harmful, right? And so she's really good at that. I'm not. So, and so I would say that those, Black people in our familyhood who feel comfortable enough to make white people feel comfortable enough to educate themselves and change their ways, right? Should step in and help them understand and see that when they make comments about Black women in leadership, like we have with our only Black woman city council member, and they say things like, "Oh, she's complicated," that is aligning with anti-Blackness. because she is not complicated. Or they say things like, oh, she's strong. You know, she got to city council. She has to be strong. She ran a campaign, you know, so are all the other folks on city council. They are strong too, because they won, right? But when you say it about a Black woman, when you say it about a Black person, it is an attack on that strength. And that is racism. That is anti-Blackness. That is anti-woman. And so white people need to understand that their language of biases, implicit bias, is aligned and under racism, has to change. But it has to change within them first before it can change within their language, because they have always been in the forefront and they have always led. And so now to ask them to take a back seat and to follow is a very difficult place for them, because they have always had this privilege that we have not. And so now we're saying, don't just say the slogan, don't just chant, don't just come out. We're saying actually put Black people in the forefront and follow them. Let them speak, let them organize, let them strategize, let them meet, let them author legislation, let them do all the things that they have been doing for generations, but let the world see you behind them. Let the world see you protecting them, as they did when we were in National City with Earl McNeil and the police were coming to arrest me, and all these white people gathered in a circle around me and said, "You will not touch her today." And the police backed up because they rather attack me, but they will not let the news media see them attack other white people. And that was astounding for everybody, even the white people that were surrounding me, because they thought we were all going to be arrested. But what they didn't realize is that in their white privilege, they were not going to be brutalized as I had been. And so these are things that there's so many different levels and levers that we have to look at when we're dealing, you know, with white people, because they can come and do whatever they want. For generations, they've been able to do that. They've been able to tell people to get out of neighborhoods that they don't even really own the property that they're on, the land that they're on. They don't own that land. They only own the homes. And really, if the land was taken back and given to the indigenous people, they wouldn't have the homes. If they did what they did in Africa, these outsiders and colonizers or descendants of colonizers would be gone. And so they should be careful in the words that they use and the deeds that they have, because they have a legacy again of devastation across every continent that they have been on.
Thank you so much, Tasha. Alhamdulillah. Someone commented here in terms of what you mentioned. When they mentioned Allahu Akbar, like God is the greatest. Just to kind of like, just as because of the powerful words that you spoke, and just, you know, attributing to this beautiful moment in the greatness of God that we're all witnessing. Alhamdulillah. So the next question and last question that we will have is Sister Zahra. So Sister Zahra, the immigrant Muslim community have been writing on the civil rights movement and sacrifice and work of our African-American brothers and sisters, Muslim, non-Muslim, across the board. And, you know, we tend to, as a community, when it comes to election work, start talking about, you know, getting a little bit into the nitty-gritties of, you know, showing up for election and making sure folks are able to vote. And as you know, from the work that CARE has done, the work that, you know, so many other organizations have done in turning out Muslims to vote, I found it a little bit more difficult to turn folks out to speak at City Hall, to show up in those critical moments where it's needed for us to really stand in solidarity in other movements outside of, I guess, the immigrant Muslim perspective, beyond just the Muslim ban, right? Making sure that we're showing up for racial justice, we're showing up for climate justice, we're showing up for economic justice, and across the board. So what message would you give, especially given the platform that we have with so many folks that are tuning in? What message would you give in regards to folks? How do we go beyond election? How do we see the work and this duty that we have to really build, to quote the vision of mass, to build a just and virtuous society? How do we get out of this box of, you know, either being social media commentators to just say showing up for the election? We're still trying to get folks to show up for elections. How do we go beyond that? How do we put in the real work to really bring about that, the vision that we have in living in a country that we all belong. And then we'll end with this.
I think first and foremost, I mean, great questions. And really quickly going back to the surveillance question, I agree with Heba. We have to ask ourselves, like, are we living our lives in a way that we have anything to hide? And that's a question of how we live our lives, not a question of surveillance. And so just making that distinction is that I still have privacy between me and Allah, between me and my family, between me and my friends. And so we need to live lives where we dot our I's and cross our T's. And we know that in the end, we are accountable to Allah. But we also need to put our foot down on surveillance, right? Surveillance is a tactic that has been used to target marginalized communities. And what I worry about in the COVID pandemic is that what we give away in terms of our rights, we won't get back when the pandemic is over. And this is something that I've worried about from the beginning of the pandemic, is that the more we are proactive, the more we rely on science, the more we say, okay, we are going to do what's necessary to be safe. We're not going to go to Black Friday sales in person. We are not going to go to Jummah in places where Jummah is prohibited. We are going to be mindful of the rules, and where we are doing these things, we're going to be very, very careful. That's what protects us from government intrusions. And where we are not doing those things, where we are putting our well-being over the collective well-being, we will see the government use its hand to restrict people, to restrict movement, and to surveil us. And we want to prevent ourselves from getting there. And so it's a fine balance, but I think that the long-term investment on our part is to really say, okay, like the concessions we make now need to be self-driven. And if they're not, then the government will force us to make them. And the difference is when the government forces us to make them, we don't get these rights back when it's over. We saw that, for example, with the war on drugs. We saw it with the war on terror. We've seen it over and over again, is that where government gets big and government gets intrusive, when the crisis has passed, which inshallah will happen with COVID, government doesn't recede and say, okay, cool, you get your privacy back, right? Like, we're going to leave you be. So I just want to, let's live our lives in a way that we would be proud to stand in front of Allah and say, Ya Allah, I did the best I could. But let's also be clear that the better we do, the less reason we give to the government to come in, right? And when the government tries to come in, we need to make sure that we are pushing back. I would much rather that masajid close on their own because they followed scientific guidance than local governments force them to close. Those are very different positions to be in. Now, in terms of the election and moving forward, Sister Isman, I think we need to be compassionate with ourselves as organizers, as leaders, right? It was just 20 years ago that so many Muslims were voting Republican, that so many Muslims were driven by a tunnel vision of what we wanted for our country and our future. In the 20 years since then, I'm speaking about immigrant Muslims really, right? In the 20 years since then, we've developed a more nuanced analysis. Our organizations have grown. We've moved even from the conversation, by the way, remember 20 years ago, is voting halal or haram? We've moved away from that. And now we've got people voting. We've got people in public interest careers. We've got Muslims who are on the Biden transition team. And as much as I can't fathom it, there are Muslims, who supported Trump and who were on that campaign. And so we've really developed and evolved and grown as a community, and these things take time, right? Our prophets, who were the best of creation, spent decades trying to move the needle on things that we take for granted right now. And so first and foremost, as organizers and organizations, we need to be compassionate with ourselves, right? As immigrants, we should look to the Black community and the Indigenous community and say, they've been working on this for centuries. Why would I think that I could do it faster than the best of the best? The second thing is that we have to keep up the work, right? So we ourselves as organizers need to invest in our mental health and in our physical health so that we too, as we approach burnout, remember that it's a marathon, not a sprint. I'm not a runner. I hope I got that analogy right? That we need to do this long distance. We need to keep going. And so it's on us as organizers and organizations to say, okay, what am I going to give my community to do the day after the election? Which protest am I going to invite them to? Which city council meeting am I going to invite them to? We know that our power as believers is in quality, not quantity. And so this is also about how we approach this, is that I got 5 people to come to a city council meeting. Guess what? That might be better than 50. And it's also better than 1. Did I invest in those people? Did those people feel like they could turn out more people the next time? This is very much how Mass has spread Islamic learning over the years, right? As you bring a small group of people into an usra and you train those people, and then they have future usras, and those future usras are out there doing Islamic work in the community. And so it takes time and it takes building. Now, all of that I've really just said for the benefit of the speakers and the organizers, the moderators on who are behind the scenes. For the people who are tuning in, I have two asks of you. The first is you have to invest in your organizations. Good work does not happen for free, period. You pay a lot of money for your cars. You pay a lot of money for your technology. You need to invest in your organizers. You need to invest in the people who are going to call up George Gascon and say, what the heck were you saying? Excuse my language, but like, what were you saying? You need to come to the community and apologize. And then 10 years later in another region say, we know your history. We're going to engage you. You need to come to the mosque if you want our support. You need to turn out for the Muslim community if you want our support. That work is not cheap. These people have to be able to build careers off of it. They are working to protect us. They are our front line of defense. And so if you have not suffered economically in the pandemic, I urge you to match your 2018 and 2019 donation in 2020 to every single organization. And then consider, again, if you have not suffered financially in the pandemic, consider increasing your donation by 10 to 20%, right? Is that the work does not end simply because Trump moved out of office, rather it continues and it's full of opportunities. And so you have to give. You really have to put your money where your mouth is or the work doesn't happen. Someone has to pay Sister Ismahan to do all of the great work that she does for mass pay. Someone has to pay Sister Tasha. Someone has to pay Sister Hiba. Someone has to pay me, right? We have to do this work. And if you want us to be able to do it as a career, right, as a life calling and not a hobby, you have to invest in it as a community. Otherwise, guess what? We're too busy to pick up the phone. And we can't take your calls on the weekends, and we can't talk to your kids when they're in crisis. And when that politician calls because they did something ridiculous, we're busy, right, in our corporate job. So really think about it. If you are here and you're like, how do we move forward? What are you willing to do? Are you going to get uncomfortable, like Sister Tasha urged us to, in the way that sometimes is the best test of all? Is I could buy all the things I want, or I could buy a little less and ensure that my career social justice warriors who work from a place of faith and principle can do this for the long haul. That's the first thing I'm asking of attendees. The second thing I'm asking of attendees is for you to continue to turn out, right? So when Sister Ismahan says that there's a city council meeting in San Diego and I need you to be there, or when Sister Hiba says, you know what, there's a new resource for mental health services for the community, I need you to spread the word, right? You have to do the work. We're only as strong as all of us doing the work together, and it's not done. If it didn't end for the best of creation, even at every milestone, why would we think that we could sit back? We have to give our lives to this work, and that means our money and our hard work. And so I leave you with that, is that don't just rely on the women and men that you see on these screens over the course of this weekend to carry us forward. It will take all of us making the best effort possible.
Thank you so much, Sister Zahra. Mic drop to all of our speakers, always just speaking from a place of just speaking from the heart, mashallah, and also really just laying it out for us to think through and reflect on. So please take everything that's been said here. Don't just stop there. The learning does not stop there. You know, information and stories and points of view were given. Please reflect on it, think about it, and do donate. Do donate. Give of your time, give of your money to all the amazing organizations that are on the ground, who are making sure that your civil liberties, your rights are protected on the daily basis and are being represented. So we will end here, inshallah. I invite folks to really do the work, and follow the amazing work that Tasha is doing, that Zahra is doing, that Hiba is doing, and all the amazing work that organizers have been doing on the ground in multiple different fields. And inshallah, we'll see you at the next session. Thank you so much. Take a breath together. We're in it together, inshallah. This is 2020 might be coming to an end, but the challenges that we face, the opportunities that we hope for, and the vision that we have and dream that we're working towards does not change, inshallah. Let's put in the work. Let's renew our intentions, put our trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and keep on keeping on, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.